Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Talk Conversation Series, a peer knowledge resource by the CXOs for the CXOs. Now to our host, Kanika Goswami.
Hello everyone. Today we have with us Mark Chamberlain. He's a Vice President of Product Development for Data Cloud, and he's also a thought leader in big data and infrastructure's point of view. So hi Mark, how are you doing? It's great to have you on the show today.
Very good. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So now that we have an expert in this field here, I quickly want to know before we start the conversation. Actually, I'm just curious to know a couple of things from you. A quick opinion, kind of an input. What changes every day today over the last 1 year? Everything that has changed the world as we know it, the world doesn't seem to be functioning in that manner anymore. Now, changing of infrastructure for technology changes a whole lot of data, how it is collected and how it is collated and how it is even used. What kind of changes do you see in the way data is being leveraged, and how do you see it evolving with that? So, Mark, this is a question for which I wanted your opinion. Would you be able to share about it?
Absolutely. So if we look at how things have changed over the past year, data has provided insights not only into how we're working in a remote fashion, but how employees are working and what kind of job they're doing and if they're doing it successfully. We've always taken data for granted and we've been collecting it, but what we're able to start doing is understanding what the data tells us and being able to collect more and more of the data. We're seeing that infrastructure is changing. It's giving us the ability to store more data in a more efficient way. And software sitting on top of it is also getting more efficient. And what we're starting to see is that no matter the size of the data and the amount of data out there, it can start being used in different ways to provide us insights. And I think over the past year, many companies have started using the data they have and collecting more of it to ensure that we can respond as an organization to our customer needs, but also our employee needs. So it's definitely an interesting time. And I think that a lot of companies have really advanced over the past year, advanced many years into 1 year to be able to start doing more with data and to provide the insights we need to be successful.
So you do see a lot of new things happening as far as data and its leverage is concerned. So what next steps can enterprises take for better manager cost development, storing, and using today's hugely evolving and much faster evolving requirement for data? How do you see that we can do that better?
Absolutely. Well, you hit on a big part, which is managing costs. And when it comes to data, if we go back many years, data and the ability to store it was very expensive. And now that what we're starting to see is that with the infrastructure changing, the costs are changing as well. So we can start storing more of it, but we still have to be very thoughtful about what we're storing and how we're storing it. So it really starts with the first thing is understanding your data. Once you understand your data, the next thing is really to understand how it's being used. And when I say how it's being used, what you want to do is start determining what are those access patterns, who's accessing it, and how they're accessing it. And once you know that, a good thing to also understand is there any kind of personal data that's involved? Because when it comes to personal data, you have to start thinking about, can that be seen and how can that be seen? So, as you're storing more of it, understanding what type of data it is, and do you have to do anything around masking or PII? I think that's something that many companies are starting to look at based on the different laws and regulations that are being put in place. Once you do that, start thinking about how much of it you want to store. Do you want to store it for a very long time? Are there different storage requirements based on maybe if it's customer data? Do you have contractual requirements to store it over a certain amount of time? And then what are you doing in order to make sure that you're backing it up or you have it in case there's some kind of issue with the data, whether there's issue with the underlying infrastructure or somebody does something to the data where they accidentally delete it. So as your data sizes increase in size, you have to start thinking about all of these things, whether it's an issue that you have to recover from or it's personal data. So once you know how it's being used, you have to start thinking about how you're going to access it. And I talked about that a little before. When it comes to managing costs, that comes down to how you're going to access it as well. And there's a lot of ways to be able to go and scale your application to be able to access that data in different ways. And it's something that public cloud providers are doing a really good job with, is providing us solutions that will allow you to horizontally scale in order to access that data, but then to scale back down when you're done accessing that data. So that really helps with managing costs as well. So it's not looking at specifically all that data sitting on storage, but it's looking at how you go and manage costs when it comes to accessing that data. And then one last thing that you could do in order to help better manage costs as well is getting rid of the data you don't need. I think a lot of companies are storing a lot of data, which is good, but you have to start asking, is that all that data needed? And if so, make sure that it is truly needed, because sometimes you're storing data that might increase liability as well, right? So it increases risk when it comes to the company. And also understanding, how the data is being used can help you store data on different types of medium that are cheaper. So if you know that the access pattern for a certain data set is very different, it's not real time, you can actually store that on a slower medium or a cheaper medium that will allow you to save costs as well. So those are some areas that you could look at in order to help manage costs while also trying to deliver on what your client or your employee needs are.
Right. And what are the major challenges that they face when centralizing their data?
That's a great question. And a lot of companies are struggling sometimes when it comes up in conversation with the data and should you centralize it, because it brings different challenges. And what usually happens as companies are building solutions and they're using data or obtaining data for the first time, what they usually do is keep it close to the group or the software product that they're developing. And what happens is you create a lot of data silos. And so what companies start doing is over time thinking about, should we centralize that data instead of having data in these individual silos? But that does cause some challenges. One of them is that if you centralize it, how does that change that existing process or workflow? And so if you have a team that's interacting with that data, or you have a product interacting with that data, if you were to move it, does that application have to change, right? Also, when you centralize it, you might start realizing that you have duplication of data, which is sometimes a good thing to understand, because duplication of data could create inconsistencies, but it also goes back to the first point we just talked about. It makes it difficult sometimes to manage your costs if you have duplication of data. But when you go and centralize it and you decide, wait a minute, we have duplication of data, you might have to change the data model. And when you do that, it goes back to the point I just raised. You might break that application or need to change it and refactor it. Again, it's a good thing to do if you can, removing that duplication of data. And it might be a good thing to refactor your application, but that's something you'd have to think about as well. But also, you have to start thinking about, as you centralize your data in one spot, does that change your security profile? If you bring all your data into one spot and all of a sudden you have it centralized, does that create an issue when it comes to who's accessing it? Do you need stricter governance around it? Because now you had data separated out across your organization based on the product and who accessed it. Now you're bringing it all together. You need to understand who needs to see what data and put more governance around it. But then you also have to start thinking about how you're supporting and patching and what kind of maintenance that you have to do now in a central spot, which means, for example, if you have data sitting in a database in a central spot, but you have now 100 applications trying to access that data, being able to go and do patching there, being able to do the maintenance from, having to go and patch a server or do a reboot, that changes now that you have to coordinate that over 100 teams where you only had to do it for one team. And then you have to start thinking about performance as well. So you start bringing all that data together. Does that change the performance characteristics of your application? And if that does change it, what does that mean? Do you have to rewrite your application in some way for it to be as performant as it was before? And you might also want to put some metrics and alerts around that as well. So as you centralize it and move it into a central spot, you're creating monitoring and alerting for consistency purposes, but also for governance, it would be a big requirement. But one of the things that's really popular is and I've heard this term used quite a bit, is that data has gravity. So when you start thinking about your data and you start thinking about moving it into a central spot, how far away is that data from your application now? And do you now not only have to change the way your data or your application is accessing the data, but does that distance now, did you create distance? And let's use an example where you might have an on-premise data center where you have your application running on-premise, but you decide to move your data to another location, whether it's a public cloud or into another data center in order to centralize it. how much distance do you have between your application and now where your data resides in a central spot? And what you start potentially noticing is that that distance is going to start creating some latency that you didn't have before. Because in your prior setup, you might have had your data in your application very close to each other. In some cases, it might have been co-located on the same piece of infrastructure. So as you move that data away, do you now start seeing that the performance of your application or there's a bigger impact to your customer or your employees that are trying to access that data because it moved a farther distance away? And what you have to start doing is saying, is that distance going to be a problem? And if that's a problem, do you have to change and maybe change your application? When applications or access to data is developed, sometimes I've said that it's very chatty. The transactions might be small transactions, but you have to do many of them in order to render the results, whether it's inside of an application or it's some kind of batch job that is taking results and putting them into a file. With chatty applications, being close together and co-located is not a problem. But as you add distance, those smaller transactions and many of those become a problem. So you might have to go and start thinking about how do you want to rewrite your application in order to be less talkative or less chatty and put bigger transactions together to be able to go and get the results in one batch instead of many smaller batches. So when you start thinking about centralizing your data, those are some of the things to think about. Like I said, how does the application change, and being centralized, how does the data change from a duplication perspective? But then how does your application need to change because the interaction with that data or that database now has changed and distance has caused a problem. So those are the things that come to mind, and some of the things enterprises should think about as they're going and thinking about centralizing their data.
And while we are on it, how can enterprises leverage tools such as ETL data warehousing for delivering exceptional customer experiences?
Oh, those are two good areas. When you start thinking about tools and tools such as ETLs or tools that will help you with extract, transform, and load, and then data warehousing, they are all having a really positive impact when it comes to customer experience. And let me explain why. When you bring data into a central spot or still keep it in silos, the ability to go and look at that data, extract it and do some kind of transformation on it provides some positives. One of the things it could do is create some data consistency for you. So for example, if you're doing extracting data and reinserting it into a table or a database, or you're going and centralizing it like we just spoke about before, being able to go and understand the data will help you create consistencies. What if you have multiple databases or multiple data sets you're bringing together that all have last name or they all have state information? When you have that information, you're going and you're doing some kind of ETL, you can actually put business logic in there to be able to make the data consistent, but also to make the data more reliable. And when it comes to big data warehousing, and as we've talked about already, more and more companies are storing data. You want that data to be good. You want it to be something that is usable and it's going to provide value. It's not going to provide you inconsistency from a results perspective. So making sure your data is clean and you understand it is important. And a lot of companies are putting business logic into their ETL process to be able to go clean it up. It will also help with redundancy as well. So if you have data sets that you're doing a lot of transformations on, bringing them together or using it, you can go and start removing redundancy and centralizing things in a table. So, if you have multiple companies or you have company name that's part of multiple data sets, you can centralize those company names in one location as part of your ETL process. And then everybody reference back to that one location for company name. And you can create consistency that way, and it helps reduce your redundancy. Another thing that's great is that it helps you understand your data better. And it also helps you understand the data lineage and usage. So, understanding where it came from through this ETL process. So if you're going and pulling data from a source and you're doing some ETL and putting it into another data source, understanding that data lineage and understanding where that data come from will help you make decisions on how it's used, the things that you need to do with it from a business logic perspective. It also helps you understand who accessed it. And when you bring back many of these data sources together, it helps you build more robust solutions as well. So we're talking a little bit about how ETL can help you create more consistent data. That consistent data will help you build a better solution. And if you're doing things around machine learning and artificial intelligence, needing big data sets and creating data models to be able to go and understand how to go and create those insights, that data is important. It's the most important part of what you're doing. You can't create a model or a consistent model if your data isn't correct. And the ETLing will help you do that. And once you bring these sources together and build more robust solutions, you can start thinking about, do I want to put this all in a central data warehouse? And if you do that, again, going back to the beginning when we talked about centralizing data, you can start building solutions that will allow you to analyze larger data sets. Instead of having data across multiple locations and trying to understand and bring that data together, if you're doing your ETL, you're creating better and more insightful data in a more consistent way, and you're putting it in a data warehouse, you can start building applications or building insights using data warehouses that will actually allow you to go across all of that data and give you insights that you never had before. So those, as data volumes increase, as retention increases, and you want your desire to store more, your ability to interact with it becomes a bigger challenge. But what we're seeing is that these data warehouses are now being developed that will allow you to go and look at that data and to look across larger data sets. And that larger data set with more analysis will help companies have more insights to what they need and help them change the way they approach either their business or their employees or their products.
And of course, help to provide a great customer experience as well.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. It all ties back to that exceptional customer experience. So if you do all of that right, you would think that your customer experience would be trending in a more positive direction, which is great.
What trends do you see shaping the future of data warehousing?
So if we start from the infrastructure side, we've seen a lot of changes over the years. And what we're seeing is that infrastructure costs are going down. The public cloud has changed our way that we interact with infrastructure. We see that infrastructure technology is getting faster. We see that we can store more data. And what we're starting to see is that with all that change in infrastructure and the way we think of infrastructure, along with the way software is changing, whether it's database technology or it's just the way we're writing applications, we're starting to see that we're able to do more with data than we ever have in the past. And what we're starting to see, and if you think about data warehousing and the way companies have been using data warehouses, is that you have data across many systems of record throughout your enterprise. And what companies have been doing is bringing that data through an ETL process and centralizing that data in a central spot and maybe leaving those system of records in place and building out a way to continue moving data between that system of record or those many systems of record into this central data warehouse. And that process, based on the volume of data and how many transactions are occurring on these systems of record throughout an enterprise, sometimes it'll take hours, if not days, in order to get that data into that data warehouse and be able to go and do your ETL processing and be able to get that data into the form and cleanliness that we talked about before and get it to a point that it's usable. So sometimes hours and days is all we can do based on what technology was. But what we're starting to see is through improvements with infrastructure, improvements with the software, thinking differently about how do you build horizontally scalable solutions that are leveraging microservices or sometimes leveraging serverless technology. What we're starting to see is that data warehouses are no longer a batch process or thought about in a batch way or thought about in days. What we're starting to see is that data warehouses are starting to be able to be a more real-time solution that companies are leveraging. And that all goes back to how things have been changing from software and hardware to allow us to get to data in different ways and do it in a much faster way. And that speed is allowing us to get back to those insights and provide those insights that go back to providing an exceptional customer experience. You're no longer having to wait days in order to get the data or to be able to use the data to determine how to react to a customer's need or to build a product that's providing insights. You're able to now start providing those solutions in near real time, which is very exciting. And we can see that continuing in the future as companies are looking at data and changing the way they process data and understand data, starting to be able to go and use that data in near real time to provide those solutions. But it's also, as software is changing, especially in the data warehousing space, it's allowing us to do better with the data itself, being able to allow us to use tools and software that allow you to encrypt data so you can do things in a more secure way, allow you to hide certain data elements and provide access based on entitlements, or provide access based on who should be able to see it and who should not. And it'll allow you to also protect individuals' data that shouldn't be seen or shouldn't be seen by certain people within an organization. And then technology around networking is getting better as well. That will allow you to protect data in flight as well as at rest. So all of these changes from an infrastructure perspective, all of this change from a technology perspective, as well as the software that's sitting on that infrastructure and allowing you to scale it differently and interact with it differently, and increase the size of the data that you're storing. All of this is coming together within the big data space and in the data warehousing space that will allow you to do things in a near real-time fashion.
And this all very neatly ties back to the first question that I asked, that things are changing and changes everywhere. And the way they are being used in the coming years, that is also going to change. Thank you very much for your time, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you so much for being with us. Please do follow us on social media for regular updates and new content.